The chandelier above the east corridor held 47 hand-blown crystals. Victoria had never counted them before tonight. But now, standing beneath their cold, indifferent light, her eyes needed somewhere to go. Somewhere that wasn't his face. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Siwoo's voice came from behind her. Low, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned that volume was for people who doubted themselves. She turned. He stood in the center of the corridor. Charcoal suit, no tie. The collar of his white shirt open just enough to reveal the edge of the dragon tattoo curling up the side of his neck. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was set. His eyes moved across her slowly. Not the way a husband looks at a wife. The way a man inventories a room. "I have allowed this to go on long enough." He didn't blink. "Whatever story you have been telling yourself about your place in this house." A pause, deliberate. "It ends tonight." Victoria's hands, folded at her waist, pressed together slightly tighter. "Siwoo, you were a transaction." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "My mother identified something useful, and she acquired it. That is the beginning and the end of your story here." His head tilted, barely. "Do not mistake proximity for belonging." "I have given this house everything. You were compensated." The word fell like a gavel. "You were a local black woman my mother pulled from obscurity and handed an opportunity most women in your position would never see in a lifetime. A roof. A name. Access." His eyes held hers without flinching. "You are an object my mother handed me. A low-born riffraff given access to something she was never built to hold." One beat of silence. "And nothing more." He straightened his cuffs, turned, walked away, measured, unhurried, certain, his shoes against the marble the last sound he left her with. Victoria moved. Her body simply knew before her mind did. The corridor was too vast, too open, too bright with its 47 crystals throwing light on everything she could no longer bear to be seen feeling. Her room door opened, closed. The lock clicked. And in the darkness, with no marble to perform stillness for, Victoria Carter's legs folded beneath her. She slid down the back of the door slowly, ivory dress pooling around her, back against the wood, palms pressed flat against the cool tile floor like she needed the earth to hold her upright from below. The first sob that came out of her was the ugliest sound she had ever made. Raw. Unguarded. The sound of something structural finally giving way. "Riffraff!" She whispered it back to the dark room, tasting the shape of it, making herself feel the full weight of it so there was no lying to herself later. "Low-born riffraff." Her breath came in jagged pulls. "He doesn't even know." The words fell out of her, quiet and disbelieving. "He was never told. He doesn't know it was me." She pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth. Because that was the part. That was the part that was dismantling her from the inside. Siwoo had been told a medical team handled it. Discreet. Professional. The kind of story a syndicate tells itself to preserve its dignity. The truth, that Madame Lee had been desperate, that no hospital could be trusted, that no syndicate doctor could be risked, that she had sent word through back channels for a local healer, a woman recommended by a trusted source as someone who was quiet, capable, and would ask no dangerous questions. That truth had never reached him. He had woken up on the 8th morning not knowing her name. "I sat beside you for 7 nights. Victoria's voice cracked down the middle. 7 nights in that back room that smelled like iron and incense, and I counted every breath you took because you couldn't count them yourself." She laughed once, broken, breathless. "Your fever spiked on the 4th night so badly your teeth were rattling, and I packed cold cloth after cold cloth, and I talked to you. Did you know that?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I talked to you because I read once that people can still hear when their body is fighting. So I talked." She dropped her head back against the door. "I told you stupid things. I told you about the market near where I grew up, the way the rain smells different there. I told you your hands were too cold and that you needed to stay." A pause. Her throat worked hard. I told you that someone was waiting for you to wake up even though I had only known you were alive for 4 days. She pressed both palms flat over her face. And then you woke up. Her voice behind her hands was muffled now, wet. And Madam Lee walked me out through a side entrance like I had been a cleaning service. And a month later, she sent a car. And a proposition. And the sob took over completely. When it released her, she was shaking. I thought she was giving me something real. The words were barely sound now. I thought she saw what I had done and she was honoring it. I thought. She stopped. Because she finally understood, sitting on that cold tile floor, what she had actually been given. Not a home. Not a husband. Not an honor. A cage, gilded so beautifully she had mistaken the bars for architecture. And the man who slept 20 feet down the hall from her every night had no idea, not one idea, that the woman he had just called riffraff was the reason his heart was still beating. He had thrown away the person who had saved his life. And he didn't even know her name when he did it. Siwoo had made it exactly 11 steps down the corridor when the sound reached him. It came through the closed door like something breaking beneath the surface of still water, muffled but massive. A cry that had no performance in it, no audience, no shape. The kind of sound a person makes when they have finally stopped trying to hold something together that was never going to hold. He stopped walking. His hand, without his permission, rose slightly at his side. A half movement, aborted immediately. His jaw tightened. The muscle along the back of his neck pulled taut. In the East Wing kitchen, a woman named Mrs. Park set down her knife. In the service corridor, 2 junior housekeepers looked at each other with the wide, careful eyes of people who understood they had just heard something they were not supposed to. Siwoo stood in the hallway for 4 full seconds. Then he straightened his collar, pressed the unfamiliar tightness in his chest down to somewhere manageable, and walked to his office. He did not look back, but his hand, that hand, didn't fully settle at his side until he was behind a closed door of his own. Hello. Are you new here? Welcome to the community. If you enjoy powerful stories filled with twists, betrayal, and unforgettable characters, make sure you subscribe to hear more stories like this. Now that you're here with us, let's return to the story. The back room in the safe house outside Seoul smelled like iron and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in weeks. Victoria had noticed that first. Before she noticed the man on the narrow bed, before she registered the 2 armed guards posted outside the door, before she fully understood what kind of household she had been quietly recommended to. She had noticed the smell, and she had opened the single small window above the washstand. Nobody stopped her. She took that as her first instruction. The man on the bed was 31 years old. She knew that from the brief information she'd been given. She knew he was the heir to something significant and dangerous. She knew that no hospital could be used, that no licensed physician could be trusted, and that the fever had been climbing for 2 days before anyone had admitted it was beyond what the syndicate's usual resources could handle. What she hadn't been told, what nobody had thought to mention, was that he would look, in the half-dark of that room, less like a crime lord's son, and more like something that had simply been pushed past what a human body was designed to endure. She sat beside him. She opened her case. She worked. On the 4th night, when the fever spiked so violently that the guards outside knocked to ask if they needed to handle the situation, a phrase whose meaning she chose not to examine, Victoria pressed cool cloth after cool cloth to his forehead, his throat, the inside of his wrists, and she talked. Quietly. Steadily. About the market near her mother's house where the mangoes came in so ripe they split in the heat. About the way thunderstorms in her hometown arrived sideways, horizontal, as if the sky couldn't be bothered with subtlety. About small, warm, ordinary things that had nothing to do with syndicates or fevers, or the particular way his hands had gone cold at the extremities, which frightened her more than she let show. "Stay," she said once, when his breathing went shallow and strange at 3 a.m. Not a command. Something quieter than that. "Someone is waiting." She didn't know why she said it. He couldn't hear her. But on the 8th morning, he opened his eyes. Madam Lee arrived within the hour, immaculate in gray silk, jade at her throat like frozen water, and she walked through the room with the efficiency of a woman conducting an audit. She looked at her son. She looked at Victoria. She pressed an envelope of cash into Victoria's hand without making eye contact and gestured toward the side entrance. Victoria left through the back door of a house she had kept a man alive in for 7 nights. She told herself it was enough, that she had done something good, that the rest was not her business. A month later, a black car arrived outside her apartment. The compound in the first season was not cruel to her. That was the thing she could never explain to anyone, not even Alima, who understood her better than anyone alive. It wasn't cruelty, that first year. It was something more sophisticated and harder to name. Indifference, dressed in luxury. Victoria had a room that cost more to furnish than anything she had grown up near. She had access to a kitchen that was a masterpiece of imported stone and German engineering. She had clothes that arrived in boxes with tissue paper and ribbon, selected by someone who understood her measurements, but not her. And she had a husband who passed her in hallways with the particular blank courtesy of a man acknowledging a piece of furniture he had grown accustomed to. She told herself she would earn her way into his attention. She cooked. Not because it was expected, the compound had staff for that, but because she knew from the 7 nights that there was something in him that responded to warmth the way all starved things do, with a suspicion so habitual it had forgotten it was suspicion. She left food outside his office during the 18-hour days. Small things. Precise things. She had paid attention to what he didn't finish at dinner and adjusted accordingly. When he came home one winter night with a gash along his forearm from something she was not told about, it was Victoria who appeared in the doorway of his study with her case, her hands steady, her face asking nothing. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down and let her work. She dressed the wound in silence. She tied the bandage with a particular knot her mother had taught her. She felt, in that room, with the lamp low and his breathing even and his arm extended across the desk toward her hands. She felt, for the first and most dangerous time, that she was home. She should have known better. A woman who has been let in through the side entrance once will always be shown the side entrance eventually. It was a Tuesday in February when she found the photograph. Not hidden. That was almost worse. It was simply in a drawer she opened looking for a pen, in the small sitting room adjacent to their shared space. Their shared space, she had called it. She had called it that. And the photograph was of a woman in a fitted ivory dress at what appeared to be a formal syndicate event, standing beside Sai Wu with the practiced ease of a person who did not need to earn their proximity to him. Victoria set the photograph down. That evening, she asked him directly. It was the first time she had asked him anything directly, and the asking alone cost her something she couldn't quantify. He was at his desk. He looked up at her with the measured patience of a man who has been interrupted during something important, and she set the photograph on the desk between them and waited. That was before? His voice was even, uninflected. Before what? Before my mother made the arrangement. He looked at the photograph the way you look at a document, then back at her. She was a relationship that served certain functions. The arrangement changed the structure of those functions. Victoria looked at him. Functions, she repeated. The arrangement required a different kind of presence in the compound. You provided that. Something cold moved through her slowly, like water finding the lowest point in a room. And she stopped, restarted. The nights that felt like maintenance. He said it without cruelty and without kindness. The way you state the load-bearing facts of a structure. Maintenance of a functional arrangement. Nothing more or less than what it was. She nodded once. She picked up the photograph. She placed it back in his hand. And she walked out of the room with her spine very straight and her face completely still, and she did not make a sound until she was somewhere he couldn't hear her. Maintenance. She had loved a man who had been doing maintenance. The test came back on a Thursday morning. Victoria sat on the edge of the bathtub in her private bathroom with the small white indicator in her hand and the early light coming through the frosted window, and she looked at the result for a very long time without moving. The first feeling was not joy. It was not fear. It was something she had no word for, a sudden cellular rearrangement, as though something inside her had shifted onto a new axis, and the woman who had been sitting on this bathtub edge a minute ago no longer existed in quite the same configuration. She was carrying the syndicate's air. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the corridor, the chandelier, riffraff. She thought about 7 nights in a side entrance and an envelope of cash pressed into her hand without eye contact. She thought about maintenance spoken in a flat voice across a desk. She thought about every meal left outside a closed door, every bandage tied in the dark, every small act of devotion she had pressed into the architecture of this house like mortar between stones. Anonymous, structural, invisible. She thought about the cage that had been gilded so beautifully she had mistaken the bars for a home. And then something happened that was quieter and more permanent than the cries she had made on the floor of her room. She stopped, not breaking down, not falling apart, not the collapsing kind of stopping, the other kind, and the kind where something inside you simply decides. She set the test down on the edge of the basin. She stood up. She looked at her own reflection in the mirror. Mahogany skin, red-rimmed eyes, ivory robe, the compound's cold white walls framing her from behind like they always had. For the first time, she didn't look like something the house contained. She looked like something the house didn't yet understand it was dealing with. She had come into this world through a side entrance. Her child would not. She turned off the bathroom light. She walked to her wardrobe. And for the first time since she had arrived in the Lee compound, she did not reach for something soft and accommodating and easy to overlook. Her hand moved to the back of the rail, where a deep emerald silk wrap had been hanging unworn since the day she'd been given it. Too bold, she had always thought. Too much. Too present. She lifted it from the hanger. She dressed slowly, deliberately. The way you put on armor when you have finally accepted that you are in a war. Then she sat at the edge of her bed, folded her hands in her lap, and began to think. Not to cry. Not to pray. To plan. Here is the continuous narrative for chapters 6 through 10. The compound noticed before Sai-Wu did. That was the thing about invisible women. When they withdrew, the absence had a texture. A weight. The kitchen staff noticed first. The morning tray that used to appear outside the east study by 7:15 stopped appearing. The particular smell of cardamom and slow-cooked broth that had drifted through the ground floor every evening like a quiet declaration. Gone. The small vase of fresh stems that Victoria had replaced every 3 days on the corridor table near the main staircase sat unchanged until the flowers browned and dropped, and nobody replaced them because nobody had ever thought to ask where they came from. They had simply always been there. Like her. Victoria ate her meals in her room now. She moved through the compound the way water moves, efficiently, purposefully, touching nothing she didn't need to touch. When she passed Sai-Wu in the hallway, she did not drop her eyes the way she once had, in the old instinctive deference she had never been asked for, but had offered anyway like a toll she believed she owed. She simply looked forward. Yeah, through him. As though he were the architectural feature, and she were the one with somewhere to be. Si-Wu noticed on the 4th day. She knew because she saw the precise moment his stride broke, just barely, just a fraction, when she passed him on the landing without acknowledgement. His head turned. She didn't turn hers. She heard him pause at the top of the stairs behind her, and she kept walking, emerald silk moving around her legs, spine vertical, the soft sound of her own footsteps the only conversation she was interested in having. She had spent years shrinking herself to fit a space he'd never actually made for her. She was done with small. Eneji found her in the East Garden on a gray Wednesday morning, which told her he had been looking. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, unhurried, aged with a face that had been rearranged once or twice by violence and had settled into something that looked permanently considered. He had been head of compound security for 6 years. In all that time, Victoria had learned 3 things about him. He said very little, he missed nothing, and he had never once looked at her the way the other staff did, with that particular cocktail of pity and careful distance. He looked at her like she was someone worth accounting for. He sat down on the stone bench across from her without being invited, which she respected, and for a moment they both looked at the gray garden in comfortable silence. Then he said, "I was there." Victoria turned to look at him. "The safe house outside Seoul." His voice was low, even. "I was one of the two guards posted outside the door." He looked at his hands. I'm then back at her. "I heard everything you did in that room. Every night." A pause. "I heard what you said to him on the fourth night when we thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I filed my report to Madam Lee. I told her the healer had performed beyond expectation and that the heir's recovery was entirely attributable to her work." His jaw tightened slightly. "She thanked me for the information and told me it would be handled discreetly." Victoria was very still. "She told him a medical team," Victoria said. "Yes. And you never corrected it." "I was given a direct instruction not to." His eyes met hers steadily. "I am correcting it now." The garden was quiet around them. A single dry leaf moved across the stone path between them. "Madam Lee has been moving resources," Eneji continued, his voice dropping further. "Internal transfers. Documentation that shouldn't be going where it's going. Someone inside the syndicate's financial structure is feeding information to a competing family, and she either knows and is allowing it, or she is the source." He reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the bench between them without ceremony. "I have been collecting this for 4 months. I don't trust anyone in this compound with it." A pause. "Except you." Victoria looked at the document, then at him. "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in this building," he said, "who has never wanted anything from it except to belong to it." He stood. "And because you're the only one who's been paying attention to the right things for the right reasons." He buttoned his jacket. "That changes the calculus considerably." Victoria picked up the document. She didn't open it yet. She simply held it in her lap and looked at the gray garden and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, clarifying weight of being useful on her own terms. Madam Lee came to her room on a Friday. No knock. The door simply opened. A reminder, elegant and deliberate, that nothing in this compound truly belonged to Victoria, including her privacy. Madam Lee entered in deep blue silk, jade at her throat, her hair immaculate, her smile the same temperature it had always been. The smile of a woman who had never needed to raise her voice because she had never encountered a room she couldn't control. Victoria was seated at her writing desk. She did not stand. That alone cost Madam Lee something. Victoria watched it, the microscopic adjustment behind the older woman's eyes, the recalibration. "You've been disrupting the household rhythm." Madam Lee's voice was conversational, almost warm. "Siwoo's focus has been affected. His performance in 2 meetings this week was below standard," Victoria offered pleasantly. A pause. "He is distracted." "Men without consciences are rarely distracted," Victoria said. "When they are, it usually means something is working on them that they don't have the vocabulary for yet." She turned in her chair to face Madam Lee fully, her hands folded in her lap, emerald silk immaculate. "I imagine that's frustrating to observe." Madam Lee looked at her for a long moment with the eyes she used to look through people. Victoria looked back. Not with anger, not with fear. With the particular load-bearing calm of a woman who has already decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. Something moved in Madam Lee's expression. Too fast to name. There and gone. "You should be careful," Madam Lee said quietly, "about the kind of attention you invite." "I've been careful my entire time in this house," Victoria replied. "It didn't protect me." She tilted her head slightly. "I've decided to try something different." Madam Lee left without another word, but her hands, Victoria noticed, were very still at her sides in the particular way of a woman exercising deliberate control over them. That was enough. She chose a Sunday evening. Siwoo was in the private study, the one with the wide window that looked out over the compound's main courtyard. the one where she had dressed his wound in lamplight and felt disastrously like she was home. She knocked. She waited. She entered when he said nothing, because silence in this house had always been permission by default, and she was done waiting for better invitations. He was standing at the window with a glass of something amber and untouched. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked like a man who had been standing in the same position for long enough that he'd forgotten he was standing. He turned when she entered. She didn't sit. She didn't apologize for interrupting. She stood in the center of the room in her emerald silk, and she looked at him with the steady, undeflected gaze she had been practicing for years without knowing that's what she was doing. "I'm pregnant." The glass in his hand didn't move. His face didn't move. But something behind his eyes did. A shift, deep and structural, like the first tremor before something large settles into a new position. "The child is the syndicate's heir," she continued, her voice even. "That is a fact you will need to organize yourself around." "Victoria, I'm not finished. Not sharp, just clear." The voice of a woman with a document in her desk drawer and an ally in the East Garden and 4 months of compound intelligence she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "You called me riffraff in a hallway. You called me an object. You said that every moment of intimacy between us was maintenance." She let that word sit in the room between them exactly as long as it needed to. "I need you to understand something before we discuss what happens next." He was very still. 7 nights, she said, in a back room outside Seoul that smelled like iron and old wood. Your fever spiked on the 4th night until your hands went cold and your teeth rattled and your guards were outside the door discussing options. She watched his face. There was no medical team. There was no discreet professional arrangement. There was a local healer that your mother pulled from obscurity because no hospital could be trusted and no syndicate physician could be risked. A pause. That healer sat beside you for 7 nights and counted every breath you took. The glass lowered. Slowly. That healer told you to stay. Her voice didn't waver. And then your mother walked her out through the side entrance with an envelope of cash and told her it had been handled. Siwoo's face had changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in performances. The way they change when something real reaches somewhere that has been unreachable. A hairline fracture, running from his jaw to his eyes. "You," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of an architecture rearranging itself. "Me." She held his gaze. "I am not asking for your love. I stopped asking for things in this house a long time ago." She took 1 step forward. "But you will respect me. You will respect the child I'm carrying. And you will understand that the arrangement your mother designed," she let the word land with everything it deserved, "is over." She turned to leave. "Victoria." She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She allowed the pause to breathe. Then she looked at him over her shoulder, just once, just briefly, with the eyes of a woman who had already begun building the next thing without him. "Get some sleep, Siwoo." Her voice was almost gentle. "You have a great deal to think about." She was at the top of the stairs when the compound shifted. It was a Sunday morning, 2 weeks later, and the household had gathered, the way households do in large, hierarchical spaces, without being called, drawn by the particular atmospheric pressure of something about to be decided. Victoria stood at the head of the main staircase. She wore deep red silk today, structured at the shoulder, fluid everywhere else. And her hair was everything it had always been, full and natural and unapologetically present, crowned with no adornment because it required none. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her spine in that new vertical configuration that made her look taller than the architecture around her. Alima stood 2 steps behind her left shoulder, small, watchful, wearing the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this particular morning for a long time. Ineji stood behind her right, arms at his sides, feet planted, the unmistakable posture of a man who has decided where his loyalty lives and has made his peace with it. Below, in the entrance hall, Siwoo looked up. He had come from his study, jacket on, face composed, every external feature of the man who had stood in a corridor and called her nothing. But he was looking at her now the way he had never looked at her before. Not an inventory. Not an assessment of utility. The way a man looks at something he has catastrophically misunderstood. Madame Lee stood to his left, jade at her throat, silk impeccable, her smile present but working visibly harder than usual. Victoria looked down at them both from the top of the stairs. She did not perform the moment. She did not make a speech. She simply stood at the head of the staircase in her red silk with her allies at her back, and her child in her body, and 4 years of invisible labor in her hands like a ledger she was no longer interested in keeping quietly. The compound was silent. Siwoo took 1 step forward, then stopped. Because something had happened. Something quiet and irrevocable and more powerful than any confrontation in any corridor. The balance of the room had shifted. The space below the stairs where he stood felt suddenly like a position that required justification. The space above it did not. Victoria held his gaze for a long, still moment. Then she turned, unhurried, and walked back into the corridor behind her. Alima on her left, Neji on her right, and the sound of her footsteps against the marble was measured and certain and entirely, completely, her own. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The man at the bottom of the stairs already knew what she had spent years trying to show him. The only difference was, this time, she was no longer showing it for him. If you need to know what Victoria does next, subscribe, because what comes next will test everything she's fighting for. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this is reaching. Until next time, remember, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be invisible. This is Hidden Love Stories. I'll see you in next one.